In her last life, she was the Shin family's true daughter, but was framed by the fake heiress Vivian, betrayed by all and abandoned by kin, and died miserably in the street. Reborn, she made a decision, no more fighting. If you want to treat anyone as your daughter, go ahead, it's none of my concern. She gave up the wealthy household, focused on her studies, and earned a guaranteed spot at Tsinghua University on her own merits. The fake heiress still causing trouble? She watched coldly, letting the other dig her own pit and fall in. A banquet setup? The guests saw the truth. Slander and entrapment? Expose it outright at the press conference. Expose her true origins? She had long since prepared the real evidence. This time, she neither fought nor clawed, neither explained nor argued. She simply watched in silence, watched the fake heiress bring about her own ruin, watched the noble family reap the fruits of their wickedness. No grand family, no kinship, she could succeed just the same. Chapter 1. The cold wind cut to the bone. I curled up in the shadow of a street corner. My body was bruised all over, my left leg broken, my face streaked with blood. 3 days ago, I had been thrown out of the Shin family, the family I had fought so hard to belong to. Sis, how did you end up like this? In my memory, Vivian stood by the luxury car, looking down at me with a triumphant smile at the corner of her mouth. That smile was a world apart from the gentle and kind act she put on in front of our parents. You set me up, I wanted to shout, but no sound came out. My throat was as dry as if I'd swallowed sand, not a single word could be forced out. Vivian crouched down and lowered her voice. Sister, do you think I'd let you take my place? In your dreams. She turned and walked away, the clicks of her heels growing more distant. I curled up in the corner as the cold wind shoved into my collar, making me shiver all over. I tried to get up, but couldn't move. My left leg was broken, every attempt sent a piercing pain through me. The world went darker and darker, I closed my eyes. In that moment, my head was full of nothing but hate. Hate for Vivian's malice, hate for my parents' indifference, and above all hate for my own foolishness. If I could do it over, I would never make the same mistake again. Claire? Claire? I snapped my eyes open and found myself sitting on a genuine leather sofa. In front of me stood a man and a woman, Richard and Victoria, my biological parents. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, warm and bright. The crystal chandelier in the living room scattered delicate shards of light, and the famous paintings on the walls were worth a small fortune. A delicate fruit platter sat on the coffee table, everything looked so lavish and grand. I looked down at my hands, no scars, perfectly intact. I had been reborn. Back to 18, back to the day I had just been reclaimed. Claire, what are you staring at? Richard frowned at me. Listen to me. From now on this is your home. If you need anything, tell us. His tone was stiff, edged with impatience. I didn't notice it in my past life, but thinking back now, he never truly wanted to acknowledge me as his daughter. 18 years of affection had long been given to Vivian. I, the real heiress, was merely an intruder. Vivian stood to one side, a gentle smile on her face. Sister, welcome home. I'll take good care of you. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were icy. In my past life I was fooled by that appearance, thinking she truly accepted me, only to realize at the end that she had been scheming against me from the start. I took a deep breath, clenching my fists until my nails bit into my palms. This time, I won't make the same mistake. I don't need it. She stood up, her tone calm. The living room fell silent for a moment. Richard was stunned. What did you say? I said, I don't need it. She looked at them, her gaze cold. You've raised her for 18 years and are deeply attached, I understand. I won't fight for anything, nor do I want to. Keep treating her as your daughter if you wish, I don't care. Vivian's smile froze on her face, a flicker of astonishment in her eyes. She probably didn't expect me to say that. In my last life, I tried desperately to fit into this family, to win my parents' approval. I treated Vivian sincerely, like a younger sister. Yet she, while basking in our parents' favor, secretly worked against me at every turn. The harder I tried, the more wary she became. The more sincere I was, the more she schemed. In the end, she drove me to the brink while she walked away unscathed. Vivian paused for a moment, then quickly smiled again, stepped forward, and took my hand. Sister, are you having trouble adjusting? It's okay, take your time, I'll help you get used to it. After all, we're sisters, we should help each other. I took a step back, avoiding her hand. Don't touch me. We're not close. Vivian's hand froze in midair, her eyes instantly reddening, tears welling up in her eyes. Sister, Victoria stood up, frowning as she glared at me. How can you be so unreasonable? Vivian was trying to help you out of kindness, what is that attitude of yours? Richard's face darkened as well. Claire, you've just come back, so speak like a sane person. This is your home, you are going to stay here. Looking at them, my nails dug into my palms again. In my previous life, they were the same. Whenever Vivian shed tears, no matter the truth, I was always the one at fault. In their eyes, Vivian was their daughter, I was just an intruder. This time, I won't fight anymore. I told you, I won't fight. I turned, my tone calm. If Vivian is your daughter, then let her be. I don't need her. Richard's face darkened. Claire. I ignored him and walked straight for the door. Victoria's voice came from behind, stop. Where are you going? I stopped, glanced back. Vivian stood where she was, tears clinging to her face, but the corners of her mouth slightly upturned, her eyes full of triumph. When she saw me looking at her, she quickly composed herself and resumed that pitiful, fragile expression, Sister, don't go. I clenched my fists. I had watched this whole act countless times in my previous life. Every frame of framing, every wrongful accusation, she always put on the same face, playing the victim in front of our parents while stabbing me in the back. This time, I wouldn't give her another chance. I have hands and feet, I won't starve. I pushed open the Shin family's door and walked out without looking back. The sunlight was dazzling, but felt unusually warm. In my previous life I had tried desperately to blend into that family, only to be betrayed by everyone and die miserably on the street. This time, having given up everything, I felt an immense relief. I no longer had to please anyone, no longer had to seek anyone's approval. Footsteps sounded behind me, Vivian had chased after me. Sister! She called, stopping me. I stopped and turned to look at her. Vivian stood at the Shin family gate, tears still on her face, but the corners of her mouth turned up, her eyes were full of malice. You think that by not fighting, you can leave the Shin family? She lowered her voice, smile icy, Mom and Dad won't let you go. Give up. I looked at her and nodded calmly, I know. Vivian froze, as if she hadn't expected me to answer that way. I turned and kept walking, my steps not pausing for an instant. In my previous life, I thought that if I worked hard enough, I could win their approval. I thought that if I treated people sincerely, Vivian would accept me. In the end, I gave everything and received betrayal from everyone, dying miserably in the street. This time, I've seen through it. If they don't want to acknowledge me, then I won't fight for it. Honestly, I never cared for it in the first place. I walked out of the Shin family villa compound and glanced back once. Vivian was still standing at the gate, staring in the direction I was leaving, her expression dark. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, and she turned away. The game had only just begun. Chapter 2. 3 days later, I was invited back by the Shin family. That day, I had just left school when a black sedan pulled up in front of me. The window rolled down and Richard's assistant stood at the door. Miss Claire, the gentleman asks you to come home. I glanced at him and turned to walk away. Miss Claire, the gentleman said if you don't cooperate, the orphanage. I halted in my tracks. I turned to look at him, my voice calm. What do you want to do? Sir just wants to talk with you. The assistant opened the car door. Please. I got into the car. The orphanage. That's where I was raised. In my past life, Vivian used the orphanage to blackmail me, forcing me to compromise again and again. She knew how much the orphanage meant to me, so she used it to threaten me every time. This time, she used the same methods. Back at the Shin family villa, the living room was full of people. Richard sat in the seat of honor, Victoria sipped tea at his side. Vivian sat on the sofa, a gentle smile on her face. A middle-aged man stood nearby, probably the Shin family's lawyer. Claire, you're back. Richard spoke, his tone stiff. Sit. I sat down opposite him and said nothing. Where did you go these past 3 days? To school. School? Victoria frowned. You just got back, why aren't you staying home? What are you doing at school? I want to study. Study? Vivian interjected, her voice sweet. Sister, if you need money, you can tell me. I'll give you my entire allowance every month. I looked at her without saying a word. Vivian's smile froze for a moment, then quickly returned. Sister, are you still angry? I know you don't like me, but we're sisters. Vivian's smile froze for a moment, then quickly returned. Sister, are you still angry? I know you don't like me, but we're sisters. Don't call me sister. We're not close. Vivian's eyes instantly reddened. Victoria slammed the table and stood up. Claire. What kind of attitude is this? Vivian meant well, trying to help you. How can you speak like that? Richard's face also darkened. Claire, Vivian is your sister, you must learn to respect her. In my last life, it was the same. Whenever Vivian shed tears, no matter the truth, it was always me who was blamed. I understand. I stood up, ready to leave. Stop right there. Richard spoke. You sit back down. I halted, turned around, and looked at him. Richard stood up and walked to me. Claire, I know you have issues with Vivian. But remember, she's a Shin daughter, and so are you. You two need to get along. I have no issues. My tone was calm. She can be the Shin family's golden girl, and I'll be the student I am. We'll keep to our own lanes. Richard's expression darkened. Vivian stood up, came over to me, and reached out to take my hand. Sister, I know you don't like me. But I really want to get along with you. Could you please? She hadn't finished speaking when she suddenly fell to the ground. Ah! She cried, clutching her ankle, tears spilling instantly. It hurt so much. Victoria rushed over and helped her up. Vivian. What's wrong? Big sister, she pushed me. Vivian sobbed. I only tried to grab her hand, and she shoved me down. There was a moment of silence in the living room. Victoria turned and glared at me, her eyes full of fury. Claire. How could you push Vivian? She just wanted to talk to you. Richard came over too, his face ashen. Claire, you've gone too far. I looked at them and said nothing. No argument, no explanation. Vivian was still crying, tears streaming down. Sister, I know you don't like me, but you can't do this to me, it hurts so much. Victoria held her tenderly. Vivian, don't cry, Mommy will teach her a lesson. She turned and glared at me. Claire, apologize to me. I didn't push her. You still dare talk back? Richard snapped. Vivian fell down right in front of you, and you still say you didn't? I didn't push her. You. Victoria trembled with anger. How can you be so reckless, child? You push someone and then won't admit it? Vivian was still crying, sobbing as she said, Mom, don't blame sister, it was my fault. I tripped on my own. You're defending her? Victoria felt even more heartbroken. Vivian, you're just too kind. I watched the scene and clenched my fist. In my previous life, Vivian was exactly like this. Every time she framed me, she would apologize first, take the blame on herself, making me look even more immature. My parents would then think she was kind and that I was the one who didn't understand anything. She used that trick countless times. This time, she used the same methods. But I would not argue anymore. Arguing was useless, they wouldn't believe me. If there's nothing else, I'll be going. I turned and prepared to leave. Stop. Richard snarled. You get back here. I ignored her and kept walking. Vivian's voice came from behind. Sister, don't go. My steps didn't falter. When I stepped out of the Shin family's main gate, the sunlight was blinding. A servant's voice suddenly came from behind. Sir, I saw it. I stopped in my tracks and glanced back. The servant stood at the living room doorway, head bowed, voice trembling. Sir, I saw it. Miss Vivian fell by herself. Miss Claire didn't push her. The living room fell silent for a moment. Vivian's crying stopped, tears still clung to her face, but her eyes had already changed. Victoria was stunned. What did you say? The servant kept his head down, too afraid to speak. Richard frowned. Did you see clearly? Look closely. The maid's voice trembled. Miss Vivian fell on her own. Miss Claire didn't push her. I was right there, I saw it clearly. Vivian's expression changed. Tears still clung to her cheeks, but the pitiful look from a moment ago was gone. She probably hadn't expected anyone to step forward and expose her. I let the corner of my mouth lift slightly and turned away. Richard's voice came from behind, "Claire." I didn't look back, I kept walking. The fake rich daughter scheme had failed. And it was exposed by the servants. Not by me, she tripped over her own lies. I walked out of the Shin family villa compound and looked back once. Vivian was still standing in the living room, her face dark. The servant's words had completely ruined her plot. She probably hadn't expected her scheme to be exposed so quickly. Even less did she expect that the one who exposed her would be a servant, not me. This time, she had miscalculated. This life, the game is only just beginning. Chapter 3. Back at school, I devoted all my energy to studying. In my previous life, because I wanted to fit into the Shin family, I wasted a huge amount of time currying favor with my parents and dealing with Vivian. As a result, my studies were neglected and my grades plummeted. This time, I won't make the same mistake. I will study, get into the best university, and carve out my own path with my own abilities. A month later, the monthly exam results were announced. Homeroom teacher Mr. Daniel stood on the podium, holding the report card, an expression of disbelief on his face. This monthly exam, our class produced the top student in the grade. The classroom fell silent for a moment, then began to whisper. Top of the grade? Who is it? It can't be the class monitor, can it? The class monitor was only third last time, how could she possibly be first? Mr. Daniel cleared his throat. Claire, first in the grade, total score 748. The classroom fell silent for 3 seconds. Then it erupted. Claire? The new transfer? How could that be? Didn't she come from an orphanage? 748 points? That score is absurd, right? I sat in the corner, saying nothing. 748 points, just an ordinary performance for me. In my previous life, if I had focused on studying, my grades would have been even better. Mr. Daniel kept reading the report card, but I no longer cared. When the bell rang, Mr. Daniel came up to me. Claire, come with me to the office. I stood up and followed her out. In the office, Mr. Daniel poured me a glass of water. Claire, your grades, how did you do it? Pay attention in class, do your homework carefully. Mr. Daniel looked at me, hesitated, then asked, when you were in the orphanage before, how were your study conditions? They were okay. Okay? Mr. Daniel paused in surprise. You ranked first in the grade and you say they were okay? I could always get this score. Mr. Daniel looked at me, his expression complicated. He probably hadn't expected a kid from an orphanage to achieve such results. Claire, have you thought about applying to a top university? Yes. Which one? Tsinghua University. Mr. Daniel was stunned, then laughed. Good, ambitious. Keep working hard, I believe you can get in. After leaving the office, I returned to the classroom. I had barely sat down when I heard people whispering. She must have cheated. Yeah, coming from an orphanage, how smart could she be? Maybe she just copied someone else's work. I looked up and saw several girls gathered together, whispering. One of them glanced at me, her eyes full of contempt. It was Vivian's close friend, Emma. I ignored them and went back to my book. After school, just as I stepped out of the gate, I saw Vivian standing there. She was wearing her school uniform, a gentle smile on her face, but I knew what was hidden beneath that smile. Sister. She came over. I heard you got first in the grade? That's amazing. How did you do it? Study hard. Vivian's smile froze for a moment, then quickly returned. Sister, you're amazing. Not like me, my grades have always been poor. I said nothing. Vivian went on. Sister, if you have the time, could you teach me? I want to improve. I don't have time. Vivian froze, apparently not expecting me to refuse. Sister. I'm going home. I turned and prepared to leave. Vivian grabbed my hand. Sister, wait a moment. I stopped walking and turned to look at her. Vivian's eyes were red. Sister, are you still mad at me? I know about what happened last time. Mom misunderstood you, but I really didn't frame you. I know. Vivian froze, you know? I know you didn't frame me. You fell on your own, the servants saw it. Vivian's expression changed. I continued, so, you don't need to explain. I turned and left. Vivian's voice came from behind, sister. Back home, no, it would be more accurate to say the Shin family villa. As soon as I stepped through the door, I saw Victoria sitting in the living room, her expression dark. Claire, you're back. Heard you got first in the grade? Her tone was stiff. Victoria looked at me, her expression complicated. How did you do it? By studying seriously. Studying seriously? Victoria frowned. You just came back, not staying home properly, running off to school every day, just to study? I want to take the university entrance exam. Take the university exam? Richard came down from upstairs. Which one do you want to apply to? Tsinghua University. Richard froze, then laughed. Tsinghua? Do you even know what kind of school that is? You think getting first in your grade is enough to get into Tsinghua? I'll get in. Richard's smile froze, his expression darkened. Child, how can you be so thoughtless? You can spout such big talk and not even blush? There was no reply. Vivian came down the stairs, a gentle smile on her face. Dad, it's a good thing that sister's doing well. Maybe she really will get into Tsinghua University. Vivian, don't defend her. Richard frowned. She came from an orphanage, what skills could she possibly have? Getting top of the class, maybe she cheated. Vivian's eyes reddened. Dad, how can you say that about sister? Sister worked so hard. What use is hard work? Richard snorted. Good grades mean nothing. She's ill-mannered, unfilial, always talking back. A child like that, what's she doing aiming for Tsinghua University? Vivian's tears fell. Dad, please don't talk about sister like that. Even if sister doesn't like me, she really did try. You even speak up for her? Victoria said with pity, Vivian, you are just too kind. I lifted the corner of my mouth slightly and turned to go upstairs. Richard's voice came from behind, stop right there. I'm talking to you. I didn't turn back and kept walking. Claire. Richard snapped, get back here. I didn't stop walking. When I reached the doorway, I glanced back once. Vivian still stood in the living room, tears on her face, yet the corners of her mouth twitched into a faint smile. She probably thought that this time she could get our parents to scold me again. Too bad, I no longer care. Vivian, I've seen through your tricks. Chapter 4. A week later, the Shin family hosted a banquet. The purpose was to introduce the Shin family's real daughter to the business community, that is, me. The banquet was held in the banquet hall of the Shin villa, with over 100 business dignitaries invited. Richard wore a tailored suit, Victoria wore an evening gown, and Vivian was dressed up beautifully. I stood in the room, looking at myself in the mirror. A simple white dress, hair pulled into a ponytail, no makeup on my face. Claire, are you ready? Victoria pushed the door open, frowned at me, you're really wearing this? Why aren't you wearing makeup? Victoria, displeased, said, today is your introduction banquet, how can you show yourself like this? I don't like wearing makeup. Victoria trembled with anger, you child, how can you be so thoughtless? I said nothing. Vivian stood at the doorway, a gentle smile on her face. Mom, sister might not be used to this kind of occasion. Let's not force her. Vivian is sensible after all. Victoria sighed. Come on, the reception is about to start. I followed them out of the room. The guests had already arrived in the banquet hall. The crystal chandelier refracted a dazzling light, a pianist in the corner played an elegant piece. The guests wore evening clothes, held wine glasses, and chatted and laughed. Richard stood on the stage and began to speak. Everyone, thank you for coming to tonight's banquet. Tonight, I would like to introduce my daughter, Claire. He gestured for me to go on stage. I walked up and stood beside him. All the guests' eyes fell on me, some curious, some scrutinizing, some disdainful. Richard said, Claire, say a few words to everyone. I looked at the guests below the stage and said calmly, "Hello everyone, I'm Claire." And then there was nothing more. Richard's expression darkened, but because of the occasion he didn't lose his temper. Vivian stepped forward and stood beside me, a gentle smile on her face. "Sister might not be used to these kinds of events, please forgive her. I'll play a piece on the piano to liven things up." The guests began to applaud. Vivian walked to the piano and began to play. I stood to the side, watching her back. In my previous life, she had been like this at the party too, appearing gentle, kind, and gifted. Everyone thought she was the Shin family's good daughter, and I was the spoiled true heiress. But this time I saw something different. Her fingers danced across the keys, yet her eyes kept flicking toward me, laced with a coldness. What was she waiting for? The piece ended, and the guests applauded enthusiastically. Vivian stood up and came over to me. "Sister, don't you want to perform? I can teach you to play the piano." "No." Vivian's smile stiffened for a moment, then quickly returned. "Then what would you like to drink, sister? I'll go get it for you." "No." Vivian's eyes reddened. "Sister, are you still mad at me?" "No." I turned and prepared to leave. Vivian grabbed my hand. "Sister, wait." I didn't stop, I kept walking forward. Vivian suddenly fell, the wine glass in her hand shattering on the floor, red wine spilling everywhere. "Ah!" she cried, clutching her ankle as tears instantly welled up and fell. The guests all turned to look. Victoria rushed over to help her up. "Vivian! What's wrong?" "Sister, she pushed me." Vivian cried. I just tried to grab her hand and she shoved me down. The guests began to whisper among themselves. "What's going on? She pushed that girl? The Shin family's real daughter? How can she be so childish?" I stood where I was, watching Vivian. In my previous life, she behaved the same way at the banquet. Every time she framed me, it only worsened the guests' impression of me. And she was always the gentle victim. My parents would scold me, the guests would disdain me, and she would win even more sympathy. But this time I already knew exactly what she would do. Memories from my past life made her tricks completely clear to me. I didn't push her. "You still dare to say you didn't?" Vivian cried, "I fell right in front of you, it was so painful." Victoria glared at me. "Claire. Apologize to me." I didn't push her. Richard came over, his face ashen. "Claire, you've gone too far. Do you know what kind of occasion this is, and yet you—" "Sir." A voice interrupted him. Everyone looked over. It was a middle-aged man, standing in the corner of the banquet hall, holding a phone. "I just took this," he said. "Miss Vivian fell by herself, Claire didn't push her." He handed the phone to Richard. Richard took the phone, glanced at it, and his expression changed. Victoria leaned in to look as well, and her expression changed too. Vivian's crying stopped, tears still clung to her face, but her eyes had already changed. "This?" Richard didn't know what to say. The middle-aged man put his phone away. "Mr. Richard, I'm a businessman, I don't like watching this kind of drama. I'll pretend I didn't see what happened today. But in the future, I probably won't attend Shin family banquets." He turned and walked away. Other guests began to murmur among themselves. "What's going on with the Shins? Did that girl fall on purpose? This act is way too fake, isn't it?" Vivian stood where she was, her face drained of color. She probably hadn't expected anyone to capture footage of her falling. Even less had she expected that person to step forward and expose her. The corner of my mouth lifted slightly as I turned and walked away. Richard's voice came from behind. "Claire." I didn't look back and kept walking. The fake heiress's framing attempt failed, again. And it failed in front of everyone. I walked out of the ballroom and glanced back. Vivian was still standing where she'd been, her face dark. Guests were drifting away in small groups, all talking about what had happened. This time, she had completely miscalculated. In front of the business world's elite, her kind image collapsed. And all of this was of her own making. "Vivian, I've seen through your tricks. Next time, you'll be worse off." Chapter 5. After the banquet, Vivian's kind image completely collapsed in the business world. Those who had once praised her were now whispering about her behind her back. Richard's business was affected too, several partners began to waver. But none of that mattered to me. I cared about only one thing, studying. A month later, news arrived from the school. The national subject competitions were opening registration. Winners would receive guaranteed admission to top universities like Tsinghua and Peking University. The moment the news broke, the whole school erupted. Guaranteed admission to Tsinghua University or Peking University? Is this for real? If you can get that qualification, your whole life is set. I stood in front of the bulletin board, staring at that notice. In my past life, I also entered this competition. But back then, because of Vivian's frame-up, I had no focus to prepare and ended up failing miserably. This time around, I won't miss it again. On the day of registration, the classroom was packed with people. I finished filling out the registration form and handed it to the teacher in charge. No sooner had I done so than a voice sounded behind me, "Claire, you're signing up too?" I turned around. It was Emma, Vivian's best friend. Emma smirked, her eyes full of disdain. "You think just signing up will win you anything? This is a national-level competition, the whole school only has a few spots. You're from an orphanage, what skills could you possibly have?" I didn't say anything, I turned and walked away. Emma called after me, "You think getting first in the grade makes you special? You definitely won't get a spot in this competition." I didn't slow my pace. A week later, the preliminary results were announced. I stood in front of the bulletin board and saw my name listed in first place. Claire, first in the preliminary selection, chosen for the school team. The classroom erupted. Claire, first? How is that possible? Didn't she come from an orphanage? How could she be this good? I sat in my seat, kept reading, and ignored the surrounding chatter. When the class bell rang, homeroom teacher Mr. Daniel came in. "Claire, come with me to the office." I stood up and followed her out. In the office, Mr. Daniel had a smile on his face. "Claire, congratulations, you ranked first in the preliminary round." "Thank you, teacher." "Do you have confidence?" she asked. "This competition only has 10 guaranteed admission spots nationwide. If you can get one, Tsinghua University is all but certain." "I have confidence." Mr. Daniel laughed. "All right, I'm rooting for you. Keep working hard." I stepped out of the office, and just as I reached the classroom doorway, I saw Vivian standing there. She was wearing her school uniform, a gentle smile on her face, but her eyes were cold. "Sis, congratulations," she said. "First in the preliminaries, that's amazing." "Thanks." Vivian's smile stiffened for a moment. "Sis, you're really impressive. Unlike me, I didn't even pass the preliminaries." I didn't say anything. Vivian stood in the doorway, her face dark. She probably hadn't expected me to be so indifferent. After school, just as I walked out the gate, I saw Richard's assistant standing at the entrance. "Miss Claire, the gentleman requests that you return home." I glanced at him. "What is it?" "Sir has something important to tell you." I got into the car. Back at the Shin family villa, Richard sat in the living room, his face sullen. "Claire, you're back." I heard you're going to enter the subject competition?" Richard frowned. "Do you know how hard that competition is? There are only 10 spots nationwide. You really think you can get one?" "I will get one." Richard snorted coldly. "You think you can get it just because you say so? You're from an orphanage, what skills could you possibly have?" Vivian came down from upstairs, a gentle smile on her face. "Dad, sister did well on her exams, maybe she really can get it." "Vivian, don't speak for her." Richard frowned. "She got first in her grade and already thinks she's something special. She certainly won't get a spot in this competition." Vivian's eyes reddened. "Dad, how can you say that about sister? Sister worked so hard." "What use is hard work?" Richard snorted coldly. "She's immature, unfilial, always talking back. What kind of quota would a child like that get?" Vivian's tears fell. "Dad, don't talk about sister like that. Even if sister doesn't like me, she really did try." "You're sticking up for her too?" "Vivian Wanru, you're just too kind." I curled the corner of my mouth slightly and turned to go upstairs. Richard's voice came from behind. Claire. If you don't get a spot in this contest, you better stay at home and not disgrace the Shin family again. Back in my room, I closed the door. Richard, do you think I won't get a spot? This time, I'll make you see what true strength looks like. On the day of the exam contest, I walked into the test hall. When the papers were handed out, I glanced over them and then began to answer. These questions were not hard for me. Although I hadn't prepared well in my last life, the fundamentals were still there. In this life, I put all my energy into studying, and these problems were even easier. 2 hours later, I handed in my exam and walked out of the hall. A week later, the results were announced. I stood before the bulletin board and saw my name. Claire, first place nationwide, awarded guaranteed admission to Tsinghua University. The classroom erupted. Claire is first in the whole country? She got the guaranteed admission spot? She's going to Tsinghua University. I stood where I was, the corner of my mouth lifting slightly. Richard, did you see that? This is my strength. I don't need the Shin family, I don't need the high society, I can succeed on my own. Back home, Richard was sitting in the living room, his face ashen. Claire, you're back. I heard you got the guaranteed admission spot? He asked, his tone stiff. Richard didn't say anything, his expression kept changing. Vivian came down from upstairs, her face pale. She probably hadn't expected that I could actually get the spot. Sister, congratulations. Her voice was dry, a guaranteed admission to Tsinghua, so impressive. Thanks. Richard stood up and walked over to me. Claire, you got the spot? He hesitated, not knowing what to say. In my previous life, he never once looked properly at my grades. This time, he finally had to acknowledge my ability. Vivian's voice came from behind. Sister. I went back into the room and closed the door. Vivian, I saw your jealousy. What will you do next? Chapter 6. After securing a recommendation to Tsinghua University, my status at school changed completely. Those who once gossiped about me have all started to envy me. Emma no longer dares to talk behind my back in front of me, and Vivian's girlfriends have all shut their mouths. But I knew Vivian would not let this go. A week later, the school held an awards ceremony. Its purpose was to honor students who had won academic competitions, and as the national first-place winner I was invited on stage to receive my award. The ceremony took place in the school's auditorium, with many parents and members of the media in attendance. I stood on the stage, accepting the certificate and the trophy, as enthusiastic applause rose from the audience below. Claire, as the national champion of this competition, do you have anything you'd like to say? The host handed me the microphone. I looked at the audience and spoke calmly. Thank you to the school for nurturing me, and thank you to my teachers for their guidance. I will continue to work hard. Applause rang out from the audience once more. I stepped off the stage and returned to my seat. No sooner had I sat down than I saw Vivian not far away, her face sullen. She probably hadn't expected me to be so triumphant. After the awards ceremony ended, I walked out of the auditorium. She had just reached the doorway when she saw Richard and Victoria standing there. Claire. Richard spoke, his tone complicated. You got the spot. A guaranteed admission to Tsinghua. He hesitated. You did well. It was the first time he had praised me. But I no longer cared. Thanks. Victoria looked at me, her expression complicated. Claire, why didn't you tell us earlier? We could have prepared for you. No need. Vivian walked over, a gentle smile on her face. Sister, congratulations. Being recommended to Tsinghua University, that's really impressive. Thanks. Vivian's eyes reddened. Sister, you're amazing. Not like me, I can't do anything. Vivian, don't say that. Victoria felt a pang of pity. You're excellent too. Vivian's tears fell. Mom, am I useless? Sister got a guaranteed spot at Tsinghua, and I couldn't even pass the preliminary round. Vivian, don't cry. Richard felt pained. You're excellent too, you just didn't perform well this time. Vivian, I've seen enough of your act. If there's nothing else, I'll be going now. Turning, she prepared to leave. Claire. Richard called after me. Come home for dinner tonight, we'll celebrate. No need. Richard's expression darkened. What's with that attitude? I'm not hungry. Vivian's voice came from behind. Sister, don't go. Back home, no, it should be called the Shin family villa. As soon as I stepped inside, I saw Vivian standing in the living room, her face sullen. Sister. She spoke, her voice icy. You think getting guaranteed admission to Tsinghua makes you something special? I stopped in my tracks and looked at her. Vivian's eyes were full of malice. You think you've won? You think the Shin family will acknowledge you? Dream on. I know. Vivian froze. You knew? I know the Shin family won't acknowledge me. Her tone was calm. I never intended to let the Shin family acknowledge me. Vivian's expression changed. You. Vivian, you're the Shin family's daughter, so keep being one. I don't need it. I turned and walked toward the upstairs. Vivian stood where she was, her face pale. She probably hadn't expected me to say that. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Vivian, what are you going to do next? In my last life, at the final moment, she played her most vicious card, exposed my origin. She had someone forge evidence to prove I wasn't a member of the Shin family, then she unveiled it publicly and ruined me. This time around, she'd probably use the same method again. But this time I was ready. I took a folder from the bedside table. Inside were DNA test reports and the real proof of my identity. In my previous life, I was unprepared and she succeeded in framing me. This life, I had long since gathered the evidence. Vivian, you want to expose my origins? Then go ahead. I'll show you who the real fake heiress is. The next day, I had just arrived at school when I saw Vivian standing at the gate. She was wearing her school uniform, a gentle smile on her face, but her eyes were cold. She walked over. Sister. There's something I want to tell you. What is it? Vivian's smile shifted, becoming icy. Sister, do you know your own origins? I looked at her and said nothing. Vivian continued, I had people investigate, you are not the Shin family's daughter at all. The classmates around us all turned to look. What do you mean? Vivian smiled, her eyes cold. What I mean is, you're fake. The real daughter of the Shin family is someone else. The murmurs around grew louder and louder. What's going on? Claire isn't the real daughter? What is Vivian talking about? I stood where I was, watching Vivian. She thought this move could ruin me? In my previous life, she succeeded. But this time I was ready. Vivian, you say I'm not the real heiress? I said calmly. Vivian laughed. Yes. I have evidence. Then show it. Vivian froze, as if she hadn't expected me to say that. You think I wouldn't dare? She took a document from her bag. This is the result of the investigation I commissioned. The DNA test shows you have no blood relation to the Shin family. The murmurs around us grew louder. I looked at the document, the corner of my mouth lifting slightly. Vivian, are you sure this document is real? Of course it's real. Vivian laughed smugly. Did you think I'd bring a fake? All right. I took a document out of my bag. This is the DNA test I had done. Look, whoever is biologically related to the Shin family. I handed the papers to her. Vivian took them, glanced over them, and her expression changed. This is impossible. Impossible? Vivian, you're the fake. The murmurs around them exploded instantly. What? Vivian is fake? Claire is the real legitimate daughter. Vivian has been lying all along? Vivian's face went pale, the papers in her hand falling to the floor. She probably hadn't expected me to produce real evidence. What she hadn't expected was that this piece of evidence would reveal her true colors. Chapter 7. Vivian stood rooted to the spot, her face drained of color. The murmurs around her swelled, everyone was looking at her. Vivian's hand was trembling, she stared at me, her eyes full of hatred. She ground her teeth. You knew all along? Yes. I knew in my previous life. Vivian froze. Previous life? Nothing. I turned and prepared to leave. Vivian rushed up and grabbed my arm. Wait. Speak clearly. Explain yourself. I looked back at her, my tone calm. Vivian, you hired someone to forge evidence and frame me as the fake heiress. But you didn't expect that I had already prepared the real evidence. Vivian's expression changed. How do you have proof? Because I am the real Shin family daughter. And you are nothing but a fake. The murmurs around them grew louder. Vivian stood frozen, trembling all over. She probably hadn't expected things to turn out this way. The news spread quickly. In the Shin family villa, Richard and Victoria sat in the living room, their faces ashen. Vivian is fake? How is that possible? The DNA test can't be wrong. Victoria stared at the papers in her hand, her face pale. Vivian, isn't our daughter? Vivian stood to one side, tears streaming down her face. Dad, Mom, I don't know. I really don't know. You don't know? Richard's voice was icy. You hired people to forge evidence to frame Claire, and you say you don't know? Vivian's crying stopped, her expression changed. Dad, Enough. Richard stood up, his face ashen. Vivian, you have disappointed me too much. Tears spilled from Vivian's eyes again. Father, I really didn't know. I was raised by the Shin family. I thought of you as my parents. Enough. Victoria stood as well, her face pale. Vivian, you've lied to us for 18 years. And now you say you thought of us as your parents? Vivian stood where she was, trembling all over. She probably hadn't expected things to turn out this way. I stood on the stairs, watching everything downstairs. Vivian's tears kept falling, but no one believed her anymore. Richard looked at me, his expression complicated. Claire, you're really our daughter? Why didn't you say anything earlier? Say it earlier? If I had, would you have believed me? Richard froze, not knowing what to say. Victoria looked at me, her eyes rimmed with red. Claire, I'm sorry, we were wrong. It's all right. I don't care anymore. Vivian, your little game is over. At night, the Shin family villa was quiet. Richard and Victoria sat in the living room, their faces ashen. Vivian had been sent back to her room and was not allowed to come out. I stand by the window, watching the night sky outside. In my previous life, Vivian framed me successfully, ruining my reputation and everything I had. This time around, I exposed her true face and turned everyone against her. Everything was over. Someone knocks at the door. Claire, it's me. It was Richard's voice. No answer. Claire, can I come in? The door's not locked. Richard pushed the door open and came in. His expression was complicated, his eyes full of guilt. Claire, I'm sorry. It's all right. We were wrong. Richard's voice trembled. We were deceived by Vivian for 18 years, we did this to you. I'm done caring. Believe whoever you want, it's none of my business. Richard was stunned, not knowing what to say. Claire, are you still blaming us? No. I've just seen through it. Richard stood where he was, his face pale. He probably hadn't expected me to be this cold. Claire, can you give us a chance? We want to make it up to you. No need. Richard froze. Don't need them? I've already secured a guaranteed admission to Tsinghua University. I don't need anything from the Shin family. Richard stood where he was, trembling all over. He probably didn't expect me to say that. Claire. If there's nothing else, I'd like to rest. Richard stood where he was, hesitating to speak, and finally turned and left. The door closed, and the room fell silent again. Richard, you want to make amends? Too late. I no longer need it. Chapter 8. After the truth came out, life at the Shin household grew harder by the day. Vivian's kind image completely collapsed. People in the business world were saying the Shin family had been raising a fake heiress for 18 years. Richard's business took a heavy hit, and several major clients cancelled their partnerships. What's going on? How could the Shin family cause something like this? I heard that the fake heiress has been framing the real heiress all along. The Shins are truly blind, treating the fake as treasure and the real as trash. I didn't care about any of that chatter. I was just waiting to leave. A week later, the Shin family held a family meeting. Richard sat in the head seat, Victoria wiping tears at his side. Vivian was brought into the living room, her face pale. "Vivian, you should leave." Richard spoke, his voice cold. "The Shin family doesn't welcome you." Vivian's tears fell. "Dad, I don't want to go. I considered this my home." "Home?" Richard snorted. "You lied to us for 18 years, and you still dare call this your home?" Vivian's tears kept falling. "Dad, I really didn't know. I was swapped at birth, it wasn't intentional." "Enough." Richard stood up, his face ashen. "You've framed Claire so many times, and you still dare to say it wasn't on purpose?" Vivian stood where she was, trembling all over. Victoria wiped her eyes on the side. "Vivian, you disappoint me so much. I thought you were kind, I didn't expect you to be so vicious." Vivian's tears fell again. "Mom, Don't call me Mom." Victoria's voice trembled. "You are not my daughter." Vivian stood frozen in place, her face drained of color. She probably hadn't expected things to turn out this way. I stood on the stairs, watching everything below. Vivian was driven out of the Shin family, and Richard and Victoria were filled with regret. Everything was different from my previous life. In my last life, I was expelled from the Shin family, and Vivian gloated. This life, Vivian was kicked out of the Shin family, and I watched coldly. "Claire." Richard saw me and stood up. "You're down." "Claire, can we talk?" "Talk about what?" Victoria stood up, her eyes red. "Claire, I know you're blaming us, but we really were deceived by Vivian." "I know." "Do you know?" Victoria was stunned. "Then you still blame us?" "I'm not blaming you. I just saw through it." Richard and Victoria stood where they were, their faces pale. They probably hadn't expected me to be so cold. "Claire, give us a chance." Richard's voice trembled. "We were really deceived by Vivian, we want to make it up to you." "No need." My tone was calm. "Give your love to whoever you want, it's none of my concern." I turned and walked upstairs. Richard's voice came from behind. "Claire." I didn't stop walking. That night, Vivian packed her things and prepared to leave. She stood at the doorway, glanced back at the Shin family's villa, her eyes full of hatred. I stood upstairs, watching her. Vivian looked up and saw me, her gaze was cold. "Claire, you won," she said, her voice icy. "But don't get cocky, I won't let you off. Do whatever." Vivian's eyes were full of hatred as she turned and walked away. Watching her retreating figure, the corner of my mouth lifted slightly. "Vivian, you have already lost. You already have nothing left." After Vivian left, life at the Shin household did not improve. Richard's business continued to decline, and several partners cancelled their collaborations. Victoria spent her days in tears, regretting that she hadn't treated me better. Alexander, son of the Shin family, rushed back from abroad, and after learning the truth, fell silent. "Dad, Mom, how could you do this? Sister has been bullied so many times and you did nothing?" We were deceived by Vivian." Victoria wiped her tears. "We didn't know she was fake." "Don't know?" Alexander frowned. "Your sister's grades are so good, and instead of praising her, you help Vivian bully her?" Richard and Victoria stood where they were, their faces pale. "What's the use of your regrets now?" Alexander sighed. "She no longer cares." I stood on the stairs, listening to it all. "Alexander, in your past life you were the same, favoring Vivian and cold to me. This time, you've finally woken up. Too bad, it's already too late." A few days later, news came from Richard's company. Several major clients cancelled their contracts, the company's cash flow collapsed, and it was facing bankruptcy. Richard sat in the living room, his face pale. How could this happen?" Victoria wiped her tears beside him. "Richard, what are we going to do?" Richard didn't speak, he just sat there, trembling all over. I stood on the stairs, watching it all. "Richard, in your previous life you did the same, ruining the company for Vivian. This life, you ruined the company again for Vivian. Too bad, I won't help you anymore. Richard, you brought this on yourselves. All of this is of your own making." Chapter 9. After Vivian left the Shin family, she didn't give up. She spread rumors online, saying I was a fake heiress, that the Shin family favored me, that I had framed her. For a while, the internet buzzed with discussion. Fake or real heiress? Who's the real one? What's going on with the Shin family? Did the real daughter frame the fake daughter? I watched the gossip and the corner of my mouth lifted slightly. Vivian, are you still struggling? Too bad, it's already useless. The next day, I held a press conference. The school had arranged the media. I stood on the stage, facing dozens of reporters. Claire, are you really the Shin family's daughter? Yes. I have a DNA test report as proof. I handed the report to the reporters. The journalists passed the report around, murmuring among themselves. What about Vivian? Is she fake? Yes. She's not a member of the Shin family, she was adopted from an orphanage. She pretended to be the real daughter for 18 years and even framed me multiple times. The reporters were in an uproar. She framed you? How did she frame you? She schemed against me multiple times. For example, she deliberately tripped at a banquet and claimed I pushed her. But guests caught the truth on camera. The reporters buzzed with speculation. Then why didn't you expose her earlier? Because I didn't need to. She framed me and exposed herself. I didn't have to be the one to reveal it. The reporters froze, then began taking notes. After the press conference, public opinion online completely flipped. So Vivian was the fake all along? She even framed the real heiress? That's so vicious. Claire is amazing, she didn't even need to strike back, the fake heiress exposed herself. Vivian, your struggle has failed. That night, Vivian called. I picked up the phone and heard her voice. Claire, you won. But don't get cocky, I won't let you off. Whatever. You think you've won? I'll make you regret this. Vivian, you've already lost. You have nothing left. Vivian was silent for a moment, then hung up. Vivian, I no longer care about your threats. A few days later, Vivian was taken away by the police. The charge was that she was suspected of falsifying evidence and slandering others. I stood by the window, watching the police car drive away. Vivian sat in the car, glanced back at the Shin family villa, her eyes full of hatred. I stood upstairs, watching her. Vivian, you have completely lost. You have not only lost the Shin family identity, but also lost your freedom. Everything was over. After Vivian was taken away, life at the Shin household became even tougher. Richard's company went bankrupt, and the Shin family villa was mortgaged. Richard and Victoria moved into a small apartment, living hand to mouth. I stood at the apartment door, watching them. Richard sat on the sofa, his hair much whiter. Victoria dabbed at her eyes beside him, her face swollen from crying. Alexander stood to the side, his face dark. Claire, give us a chance. Richard's voice trembled, we want to make it up to you. No need. I'm going to Beijing. Beijing? Alexander frowned. What are you going to Beijing for? To attend Tsinghua University. Richard and Victoria stood where they were, hesitating to speak. I turned and walked toward the door. I stepped out of the apartment and looked back once. Richard and Victoria stood at the door, their eyes red. Alexander stood to one side, hesitating to speak. I turned and walked toward the distance. In my past life, I was expelled from the Shin family, left to wander the streets, and met a tragic death. In this life, I chose to leave the Shin family and walk into the light. Everything was over. Vivian, you lost. Richard, Victoria, you lost too. And I won. I don't need a wealthy family, I don't need familial affection, I can succeed just the same. Chapter 10. A month later, I boarded the plane bound for Beijing. Sitting on the plane, watching the clouds outside the window, the corner of my mouth lifted slightly. In my last life, I tried desperately to fit into the Shin family, and ended up betrayed by everyone and dying miserably on the street. This time, I let go of the Shin family, focused on my studies, and successfully turned my life around. Everything is different now. The plane landed at Beijing Capital Airport. I walked out of the terminal and looked at this unfamiliar city. Beijing, here I come. Tsinghua University, here I come. Tsinghua University's campus, with ancient trees soaring and buildings of simple elegance. I stood at the school gate, staring at the four large characters Tsinghua University, my heart full of emotion. In my last life, I dreamed of getting into Tsinghua. But because of Vivian's scheming, I didn't even make it to college. This time around, by my own strength, I earned a guaranteed admission to Tsinghua. It was all worth it. On the first day of school, I walked into the classroom. The classmates were buzzing with chatter, some curious, some excited. I heard our class has an admission by recommendation student. Seems like she's first in the whole country? Seriously? I sat in my seat, saying nothing. The class bell rang, and the homeroom teacher walked in. Hello everyone, I'm your homeroom teacher. First, let me introduce our guaranteed admission student, Claire. All eyes fell on me. I stood up, my tone calm. Hello everyone, I'm Claire. And then nothing more happened. The homeroom teacher paused, then laughed. Classmate Claire is very low-key. Alright, everyone, let's continue the lesson. College life was simple and fulfilling. I attended classes, studied on my own, and did experiments every day. My days were busy but meaningful. Members of the Shin family called occasionally, but I rarely answered. Richard and Victoria wanted to make amends, but I didn't need them. Alexander wanted to get close to me, but I wasn't interested. I didn't need them anymore. A year later, my grades at Tsinghua were still at the top of the class. The teachers all had high expectations for me, and my classmates all admired me. Claire, you're amazing. How did you do it? I want to be as excellent as you. I looked at them, the corners of my mouth lifting slightly. There was no secret, just focus. Focus on studies, focus on yourself, don't be distracted by others. The year I graduated, I received the Outstanding Graduate Award from Tsinghua University. Standing on the podium, I looked out at the audience and felt a swell of emotion. In my past life, I used to dream of standing here. This life, I made it. No need for a wealthy family, no need for familial affection, I can succeed all the same. After graduation, I joined a top-tier technology company. Thanks to the knowledge and skills I accumulated at Tsinghua University, I quickly became a core employee of the company. A few years later, I became the company's technical director, with an annual salary in the millions. I stood in the office, looking out at the city of Beijing, the corners of my mouth lifting slightly. Vivian, did you see that? Richard, Victoria, did you see that? This is my strength. I don't need the Shin family, I don't need the elite, I can succeed on my own. From time to time, I get news about the Shins. Richard's company went completely bankrupt, and he and Victoria moved into a smaller house. Alexander was still working hard, trying to salvage the Shin family's reputation. After Vivian was released from prison, she had nowhere to go and had to take odd jobs to get by. I looked at these reports without a ripple in my heart. The Shin family's matters had nothing to do with me. Vivian's fate was brought on by her own actions. Richard and Victoria's regret was of their own making. I no longer cared. A few years later, I founded my own company. Thanks to years of hard work, the company quickly became a leader in the industry. I stood at the company's entrance, staring at the four big characters Claire, the corners of my mouth lifting slightly. This is my life. No need for a wealthy family, no need for familial affection, I can succeed just the same. Sunlight spilled across my face, I closed my eyes. Everything from my past life was already behind me. Everything in this life had only just begun. The future still held infinite possibilities. I opened my eyes, the corner of my mouth lifting slightly. A new life had begun.